Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Amy Wax, and we're going to be talking about the decline of bourgeois values in Western society. Professor Wax, I've been following your work for some years. I don't know if you remember this, but some years ago, you were interviewed by Brian Lama, and I enjoyed that interview. Professor Wax, why is Western civilization superior to other civilizations?
Well, you use the word superior. I'm sure that's going to get a lot of people's hackles up. It shouldn't, because it's a perfectly good English word, but one that the left doesn't like us to use. But I think that it is superior in a number of important respects, at least now. I mean, historically, it's maybe that hasn't always been true, but certainly in the modern era, there are many aspects of Western civilization, so to speak, that are work better, are more functional than others. Everything from the development of science, technology, and innovation to running markets and financial institutions that lead to the widest prosperity for the greatest numbers, to institutions of governance and democratic conventions that give wide participation for the population and guarantee basic rights. And I would include the rule of law, a dedication to the rule of law as the paramount set of rules that govern how our society is conducted. So, we could go on because there are other
Yes, we can
areas.
definitely go on. Professor Wax, the good governance revolution was started in the West. Usually, Western countries introduce a policy and then others follow.
Well, sometimes they follow. I'm not sure that that's been uniformly true. Yes, there is a lot of emulation and aspiration, a lot of looking to the West, certainly in respect of wanting the nice things that the West has generated. There's a lot of desire in that direction. I think people from many parts of the globe would like to live the way we live in the West. But I think that there are problems in implementing that. There are many societies in which people or their leadership doesn't seem to really comprehend how to get from where they are to where we are. Either there's resistance to adopting some of our conventions, or there's a lack of understanding, or a lack of restraint, a lack of sophistication or education, and or maybe just dogmatic or religious precepts that are contrary to what's happening in the West. And what that means is a lot of parts of the globe have followed us only imperfectly or not at all. Now, there's a superficial level on which our inventions and our creations have spread rapidly throughout the globe. So, certainly our science, our technology, our medicine, all of our inventions, our cell phones, our computers, our TVs, our airplanes, which all come out of the West, they are used worldwide, yes. But other elements that make the West quote unquote superior, such as low corruption, our governing institutions, our norms and conventions, our bourgeois values and habits and practices, and just the general sense that our leadership is there to promote the general welfare, that's critical too. Those ideas have diffused very imperfectly.
And our respect for time. So,
Yes, well,
Western culture is
right.
a time culture, and time is super important. And the outside of the non-West, time is not respected everywhere. We have tons of academic papers on this topic.
Yeah, and I mean, so little things like punctuality, which seem trivial or inconsequential, but in fact are absolutely crucial, right? And actually tie into broader themes like sense of individual responsibility or of duty towards consideration towards others. I mean, actually, I think punctuality goes back to the golden rule, which is doing unto others what you would have done unto you. So all of that stuff sort of ties together. Um, Another factor that I think is extremely important that people underestimate and don't talk about enough is corruption, governmental corruption. I mean, if you think about it, there's really only one tiny corner of the globe, Europe, mainly Northern Europe, and the Anglosphere, where governments and people in governments show relatively low corruption. They're not in it for themselves, they're not in it to enrich themselves, and there are strong conventions of disapproval of that sort of behavior and democratic accountability towards that sort of behavior. And in every other part of the world, corruption is endemic, and that is a big reason why those places, quote, can't have nice things.
Limited versus generalized morality. So Guido Tabellini, he has a paper on morality, and he argues that in the western part of the world, in Western Europe, people express a generalized form of morality. So they are respectful to individuals based on their value as a person. There isn't a strong preference for the tribe or the in-group, whereas in the non-Western part of the world and in some parts of Southern Europe, there is a preference for a limited morality where individuals are judged based on their tribal affiliations. And outside of the West, this is the norm. So, where I'm from in Jamaica, you call any agency, it could be a public agency or a private agency, and the service is poor. And then you say, well, I know John Brown, and then the person would respond by saying, well, you didn't say that, I know John Brown too. And you become super courteous.
Right. So there is that contrast, as you point out, but I would prefer to think of it as a balance. It's a matter of degree, as so many things really are, and conservatives recognize that, but absolutes only have a place very selectively, because in the West we do have a certain degree of tribalism, of sort of fealty, primary fealty to family and responsibilities of those closest to us. So I think that's healthy, but it has to be counterbalanced by this respect for people outside our close circles as individuals and a recognition of what we owe to those people as well. And we're constantly working on that balance. And I think what's happening in the West, and it's very ominous, very concerning, and it's going to hurt us egregiously, is that we have moved away from that kind of universalism, although we often pay lip service to it, to a kind of identity grievance politics that once again puts front and center our group affiliations. And that is potentially very destructive because it's moving us backwards. It's moving us backwards from what we have achieved in terms of sense of responsibility to the whole. We also have nationalism, which for a lot of people is a dirty word, but I don't think it is
Neither do
because
I, even though I'm a libertarian.
right. Well, there are definitely tensions there. I know between libertarianism and and a sense that nations are important organizing entities. And I think they are important organizing entities because of human nature. There is a limit to how universalistic and even handed people can be when they're regarding individuals who are very distant from them, with which they have few affinities, and those who are closest to them and more like them and part of their biological group or their cultural group. And once again, it's a matter of balance and nationhood, citizenship, being part of this entity enables us to somewhat circumscribe our circle of fealty in a way that I think is more manageable for people and creates a stronger social system.
Nationalism is a vital source of social capital and even innovation. The nation state requires a certain type of characteristic to succeed. So America is a group of people who share certain characteristics. If one intends to migrate to America, he ought to assimilate. Failure to assimilate will undo the greatness of America. That's not impossible.
Yeah.
People often say America is about individuals and individualism is important, and I am individualistic, but a country requires a certain set of core values and norms. And American norms are often individualistic, but many migrants are from countries that are collectivistic.
Correct.
And
Correct.
that could pose a problem in the future. So many studies have been showing that Americans succeed at assimilating migrants, but I am predicting that this is likely to change in the near future because
Well,
multiculturalism is being encouraged.
I think it's contestable how successful we are in assimilating migrants. I mean, we're better than some other places. But I think the real problem is that this whole notion of assimilation as an imperative for newcomers and a really strong conception of what it is we're assimilating to, I think both of those are on the skids. It's not fashionable among our opinion shaping elites to talk about assimilation at all. That word has kind of dropped out of the vocabulary and been replaced by this concept of multiculturalism, that every culture has to be respected, people have to be able to retain whatever elements of their culture they've brought with them and be proud of it and not be interfered with. That seems to be the reigning conception. And then, of course, what is it we're assimilating to? I mean, I actually am very traditional and conservative in this respect. I think that the dominant culture that we ought to be assimilating to is the our founding culture.
I agree, but that's a problem because it is no longer fashionable to laud the founding fathers without saying, oh, they were slave owners. So apparently, the founding fathers were these monsters, even though they had a great conflict with slave ownership, in contrast to the Asante Empire, Dahomey Empire, and even the Igbos who trafficked slaves even in the 1950s.
Well, exactly. And I mean, I'm not saying the founding fathers were perfect. And there was this tension, there was this problem. They recognized it, that the ideals and the structures and institutions and their aspirations were in serious tension with the continuation of slavery in the country. They understood it. I mean, Jefferson said, I tremble when I think that God is just. And as you say, they also, their ideals, their conceptions were at odds with the continuation of slavery, unlike in other parts of the world where people saw no problem at all reconciling slavery with other parts of their way of life. We had the seeds of improvement in our founding concepts and our founding genius, and we made good on that. I think we sincerely made good on that. It took a while. A lot of people died, and a lot of nasty things happened, but it eventually came to pass. So to focus just on the slave owning part of our founding is a huge distortion. It's the kind of distortion that goes on all the time because we've got this anti racism obsession now that crowds everything else out. But I think the positives of our system need to be stressed. They need to
They
be learned, they need to be understood, they need to be revered by the people who come here because they are the predicate for the nice things that they are seeking.
exactly. Amy, I frequently say I am not a white supremacist. I am a Western supremacist. Like most people, Western culture is superior. That is why people are migrating to Germany, America, England, and Canada, France, and not Japan or even South Korea or Singapore. They're rushing to rich white countries. They're not
Well,
rushing to rich East Asian countries. They want to live in countries like America and England and Switzerland. So obviously, there is something special about Western culture. If Western culture was not special, people would be flooding to the Middle East.
Right. Well, I think Western culture, there are a lot of reasons why people are coming here rather than Japan. And of course, there are huge numbers of reasons why they're coming here rather than to, Southeast Asia or Africa or even, South America. But one of the reasons they're coming here, apart from the fact that we have a better functioning system and there's more opportunities, is that there is an important element of universalism and welcoming to people of all types to be able to come and participate in this country and in the West generally, maybe less so in Europe, but well, more so here, that is absent in other societies. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no ethnic inflection to our country because, as I said, we were founded on a kind of Anglo American set of precepts. It was very specific, came out of a very particular place and sets of traditions, British traditions essentially, of governance, of rights, of innovation, of enterprise. All of that stuff didn't come out of nowhere, it came out of somewhere, right? And it's very important to retain all of those elements and all of those habits. But once again, it's a balance. And we have a sufficient degree of openness
Yes.
in our society that anybody can participate if they want to.
And America, like England, is driven by overly ambitious people. So in Western societies, I have recognized that civil society is not a government invention. So when you trace the history of the West, it becomes obvious that universities, churches, welfare foundations, research institutes, most of them were built by private individuals rather than the state. Whereas in other countries, the state is the primary initiator of growth and development. In the West, people drive growth. So I'm from Jamaica, and in Jamaica, people will say the government should start an apprenticeship program. And I would respond, in Germany and America, entrepreneurs invest in apprenticeship. People
Right.
drive growth in the West, not the state.
Right. So I think that's a very important point, and it goes to your observation about collectivism, people looking to the government, the sort of individual relating to the government and nothing in between. Edmund Burke talks about the little
The
platoon,
platoons,
the
yes.
robust civil society, and I think that the remarkable development of civil society in our history, if you study it, it's just awe-inspiring, really. That comes out of a very, very long history, British traditory of what I would call the Whiggish suspicion of concentrated power. It goes back centuries, maybe to the Magna Carta and before. Where did it come from? Well, we could argue all day about where it came from, but it definitely exists, and it's very very healthy because certainly for much of our history and all of those institutions are starting to wither on the vine, unfortunately, presently, but in the past, it is remarkable how many spontaneous organizations, entities, civic formations there were to take care of all sorts of human needs. And that was just a constant feature of our history that accounts for a lot of our success and a lot of our strength. And each ethnic group, many ethnic groups, maybe not all, came and engaged in these sort of collective self-help activities. Actually, blacks who were at a terrible disadvantage for most of our history until we finally had the civil rights era and things improved. They also engaged in exercises in self-help and sort of collective support, and a lot of those have withered in the face of governmental supplanting of the functions that they used to perform.
Yes. I've read David Beto's work on the topic, and that you are indeed correct. It's unfortunate. Professor Wax, recently you were interviewed by Glenn Lowry, and the media ran with a quote that you made saying that Asian Americans should be expelled from the United States. What exactly did you say again? I don't remember that quote.
I didn't say that. I
Yes,
didn't say that. I said it wasn't actually on his podcast. It was a Substack discussion after his podcast
okay,
in which I was engaging with a friend of mine, actually, a man named George Lee, who is a conservative Asian person in New York City, who's actually been fighting against the abolition of the exam schools
yes.
and affirmative action. So he's definitely on the right. And I was we were engaging actually the topic of why Asians vote for Democrats, which they overwhelmingly do. And people keep saying, oh, well, Asians are moving to the right, they're moving to the Republican Party. They are in small numbers, but if you look at the numbers overall, Asians still vote for Democrats
Yes.
overwhelmingly. It varies from group to group and ethnicity to ethnicity. And I was puzzling over that as I've puzzled over why Jews vote for
Yes,
Democrats, which
yes,
is an
yes.
enduring mystery. So we were specifically talking about voting patterns, and I was speaking about how unfortunate, in my opinion, it was that Asians didn't recognize that their interests were not best served by the Democrats, but also I was dismayed by the increasing influence and presence of Asians because I thought they voted the wrong way. And as long as they did, I said, probably I would prefer that there be fewer Asians rather than more coming to this country because I thought their influence was not positive, which is a perfectly, legitimate.
Reasonable assumption.
Yeah, I mean, I was critiquing the way they vote and how they sort of jump on the DIE bandwagon
Yes.
and all of those things that they do, which I don't think serve their interest in the long term or serve our interest in the long.
Asians are highly intelligent, they're fiscally responsible, but if they vote for democratic policies, especially democratic policies that are counter development, then it would be preferable for fewer Asians to migrate to America. That's perfectly logical.
But I actually, in the same conversation and also in other settings, like being on Tucker Carlson, I acknowledge all of the upsides, all of the virtues of Asians, their low crime rates, their very solidaristic families, their stable families, their hard work, their intelligence. There's just lots of positives. So, Asians do bring a lot to the table in our country,
Yes.
but their kind of collectivist mindset, their willingness to, join the elites in whatever ideas are fashionable at the moment without, in my mind, sort of thinking through what those commitments entail and long term for them
Yes.
and everybody else, those are, I think, downsides of having more and more Asians here. Frankly, it's just realism.
Yes.
I
And
recognize that.
I also oppose those who would wish to displace the power of white Americans. I don't know about your position on genetics, but I have interviewed many psychologists and academics who tout genetic explanations for income disparities. And ca- Asians are lower in openness and individualism than whites, even after migrating to Western countries.
Yes.
Whites as a group are not as are not as tribalistic as other groups. They're low in ethnocentrism and they're also impartial. And America, where most institutions are managed by non-whites, will not be in favor of Black Americans. Black Americans do have tensions with Hispanics and other minority groups, but strangely, there's this outrageous assumption that if we get up tomorrow and all institutions are managed by Asians or Hispanics, Black Americans are going to fare better. And I argue, no, this can never be true based on what we know about group differences and group personalities and how white Americans have been treating black Americans. White Americans have basically ceded the debate to black Americans. An America that's governed by Indians, for example, will not will not vote in favor of affirmative action. Black Americans have scored greatly in America because America is dominated by whites, and whites are likely to sell out their groups. That's not impossible. Whites are quite low in tribalism. So the Pew consistently shows that whites care less about their heritage and race than other groups. And even during slavery, white people in Europe were more likely to side with black slaves in the Caribbean than working class white people in Europe. So historically, whites have been likely to sell out their group.
Well, I mean, there's a lot going on here in your comments. I mean, one one issue is, how will blacks fare under the dominance of different types of people in American society? I agree with you. It depends on what policies you think are good for blacks. I mean, I don't really think affirmative action is that good for blacks or good for the country as a whole. So,
Economic freedom is good for blacks, but other than
yes,
a few conservative blacks, many of them don't agree with that statement.
right. So, I mean, there's a lot of room for dispute in what's good for blacks, right? But I think, this is a point I do agree with, which is that different groups have different clusters of traits and preferences and habits and norms. They just do. Some people think, well, once they come to the United States, it'll get ironed out and homogenized. That's kind of a variation on magic dirt, right? I don't think the data bears that out, and I don't think that that will actually happen. I mean, some people will become highly Americanized, but once you get a critical mass of people from a particular culture, they tend to clump together and reinforce that culture, and that's just a fact, right? Now, what is the source of those differences and their stickiness? That's highly contestable. I mean, it's, cultural traits are themselves very sticky and autonomous. We don't really understand where different cultural traits come from or how to change them. Other people I recognize think there is a innate component to some of these preferences or traits, collectivism or passivity versus boldness, audacity, innovativeness, that sort of thing, which the West seems to be known for. Is there any kind of genetic basis for these differences? Here's what I'll say about that. It's entirely possible. I don't think it's been ruled out, and I think there's a lot of data that is consistent with that. But how much of an influence it has, we have no idea, in part because it's now taboo to look at these questions.
Well, I
It's
look at these questions all the time on this show.
No, I know that, but I'm saying
Yeah.
as scientists, as of course, and we're talking about them, and the podcasts I'm on and the people that I hang out with, they are perfectly willing to talk about these issues. They don't shy away from them. But what I'm really saying is to do the sort of intricate genetic science that will illuminate these questions, right, is a very resource intensive endeavor, and it requires, generous funding and a bunch of very smart people to look at, the genetic distribution of traits that we have among peoples in various places of various types. And that kind of research, which is, scientific, biological, genetic research, to answer the questions of nature versus nurture, that kind of research is very much under a cloud. It's under suspicion. I mean, if you want to do that sort of thing, you're not going to get hired, you're not going to get promoted, you're not going to get funding. There's a lot of vigilance because there is this ideology out there that is powerful, right? Which is that these differences are either contingent, they can be erased, or they're salutary, or they're the result of racism and evil doings on the part of the West and white people. I mean, there are all of this dogma that you have to come up against, and some of it is really borders on the nonsensical. But there it is.
Joseph Henrich, he's on the cultural side of the debate, but he has a brilliant book titled Weird. I interviewed him some time ago, but if you read Joseph Henrich's book, this can lead you to some of the genetic studies, and there are newer genetic studies that have been published since the publication of Henrich's book. I try to keep tabs on these studies as best as possible because on this show we have to be accurate. And personally, these studies are not controversial. Controversy means you're different. But when you quote a really lame idea and people say that it's so controversial, you have to cite the study. But to be honest, sometimes I get quite bored talking about these issues because they're basically bridge on the water. Oh, what's that saying again? Water on the bridge?
Water under the bridge.
Yeah, basically water on the bridge. They're not that exciting. I've been looking at the data for a long time. I've interviewed many of these people. I've read preview papers, and it's not a big deal. It
Well, I
it
mean,
it is what it is.
it's not a big deal to you because you're an empirical type person who wants to look at the facts in a, objective, dispassionate way to the extent that you can, an impartial way, as you said. And but you go into academia where I am, and where for now I am employed. I don't know how much longer, right? And from inside the belly of that beast, okay, I can tell you, Lipton, that these ideas are forbidden. I mean, they are forbidden. Okay, so we have this kind of gray zone of ideology about human differences. And it's ironic because there are contradictions all over the place. I mean, diversity is the most important value. Diversity is celebrated. Why? Because all these different groups bring different attributes or experiences to the table on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have to hold to the ideology that all groups are the cookie cutter mirror images of each other, right? If you deviate from that, you will be immediately hung out to dry. So, take, for example, the Harvard affirmative action case, right? In the Harvard affirmative action case, even the people challenging affirmative action take umbrage at the possibility that the average profile of personalities of Asians might differ from, let's say, white Europeans or blacks, right? Such that Asians are judged less exciting, less interesting, more narrow in their interests, more scientific in their interests, less creative, and that might result in them being admitted at lower rates if the university prefers something else, right? And that's a cause for outrage. But if Asians score better on standardized tests and are better at academics, and that results in different rates of admission, that's okay. Well, I mean, those two positions aren't
I
consistent with each other.
I must say, Amy, that there is this writer called, is it Boogles? I can't remember his last name. No, but he published some papers on irrigation and innovation, and these papers show that there's a link between irrigation and the collectivism
Hmm.
and the lack of innovation. And in his paper, he also cites many studies showing the profiles of Asians and their propensity for employment in more innovative professions. So stereotypes about Asians are not enough. They're actually accurate. Asians do have the ability to innovate, but they're less inventive than white Americans. So even today, most Chinese patents are non-inventive patents.
Well, that's entirely possible. And, we are seeing, for example, in the United States, and we don't have a representative sample. That's part of the problem because the people who come to the United States from Asian, South Asia, East Asia are, they are tend to be elites. They tend to be the best and the brightest, and of course we have huge populations we're dealing with, so there are going to be a fair number of those talented people coming over. But we have areas like Silicon Valley and academic medicine where Asians are gravitating, especially South Asians, Indians, people from India, and they seem to be succeeding. But I think the proof of the
No,
pudding is in the
those
eating.
Asians are more assertive. So Richard Nisbet, he has a paper on the subject matter, and
Sure.
those Asians are more assertive than East Asians.
Yes, and I think that on average seems to be the case, and it kind of plays out in the roles that they go into and occupy in American society, and whether they actually climb the ladder. Take East Asian women, they are relatively, maybe on average, passive, and so that's going to play out in whether they move into corporate hierarchies and stuff like that. But I mean, the thing that I'm interested in and remains to be seen is whether America as a leader in biomedical and scientific innovation, whether that is going to continue as we see demographic shifts in our scientist and population. And, I don't know because I can't predict the future, but it's entirely possible that, innovation and
Yes,
creativity will slow down. I mean, that could be for a lot of different reasons, so it's hard to, pinpoint the reason why
Amer
that would happen.
American hegemony in innovation can be suppressed due to affirmative action policies that are preferring less competent minorities at the expense of more competent white males. So I have an essay arguing that white males are basically America's greatest asset. And in this essay, I make
You're not going to get me disagreeing with that.
a clear case. One, men are more individualistic than women, and individualism predicts innovation, economic growth, institutional quality, and good governance. On average, men are also more intelligent than women, and whites are more individualistic than other groups. So white men are particularly individualistic. So white men are America's greatest asset. Even today, the average American entrepreneur is an upper middle class white man.
Right. Well, there's really
But
two issues
Amy,
here.
we're going to do a second link, so I'm going to close this.
Oh, okay.
All right.